Welcome to Plain Talk with Steve McVey, where you won't hear the same old self-help hype or the heavy-handed religious prescriptions that have never worked for you before. You're about to hear good news that can help you live the life you were created to know and enjoy. Here's Steve.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to my first podcast. I'm so glad to be starting this thing. You know, I'm not one of the early adapters when it comes to technology. I've had folks for a long time asking me about starting a podcast, and I procrastinated. I've done a lot of other stuff with media. I've been on TV for many years and radio, and I've done video recordings on the internet and all kinds of other things, but have just not gotten around to doing a podcast until now. But I am glad to be doing this one with you, and I hope that you will become a regular listener. I'm going to be talking to you about a lot of different subjects, and along the way I will interview guests. I'm going to talk to you about things that are on my mind, and this is going to be sort of a free flow of consciousness type production. This is not something that I'm preparing for. I'm not teaching something to you. We're going to talk today about a few things. I want to begin by mentioning why I'm calling the podcast Plain Talk. And then I'm going to move on and talk to you a little bit about my own journey. I want to explain to you how I have come to the place where I am. Now, this podcast and every episode is going to be for people who have a spiritual appetite. You may be a Christian, you may not be a Christian. Today I'm going to talk to you about how I, as a former Christian pastor of churches, have come to the place where my concept of God is completely different from what it was as a pastor. I left the pastorate 20 years ago, and over 20 years, about 22 years ago now, and I've not served as a pastor in all those years. My understanding and my belief about who God is has radically changed. And the truth is, maybe some of the places where I served as their pastor through those years wouldn't want me today if they hear everything that I believe now. But I'm going to be talking about that and tell you what the transition is. Oh, don't get the wrong idea. I've not abandoned belief in God or anything like that, but I do have a very different mindset. We're going to talk about that today. Well, first, let me say a word about the name of the program, Plain Talk. I'm calling it Plain Talk for a simple reason, and that's because that's what I'm going to do. It's going to be talk. There's the key word there. I'm just going to talk to you again about the things that are in my mind. Through the years that have gone by, I've done a lot of teaching. And some of you who have walked out this journey with me over the last 20 years have heard a lot of my teaching. I've written a lot of books, 17 books at this point, and many of you are followers of my writings, and I am glad to have you joining me here on the podcast. But on this podcast, the format's going to be different from what some of you might have heard me do in the past, because I'm not going to teach, I'm just going to talk. Plain talk. I'm going to talk to you about a lot of different matters, as I said. They will be obviously examined and discussed through a spiritual paradigm. Let me say on the front end, if you're not a Christian, that's okay. I think you're going to find this beneficial. I think you're going to find it helpful, even if you don't profess to be a Christian. And the fact that I said I was a pastor all those years is a true fact. But listen, don't prejudge me. Don't prejudge me. Because I'm telling you, you'll hear me say some things that you probably aren't going to hear at church. In fact, one of my best-selling books was a book I wrote called 52 Lies Heard in Church Every Sunday. So don't come to a quick, impulsive judgment about who I am if you don't already know me, just because I said I was a pastor for over 20 years, because you might be surprised, and I hope pleasantly surprised. So I'm going to be talking, and I'm calling it Plain Talk, because I'm going to be speaking plainly. For those of you who are heavily involved in church, and you've listened to a lot of Christian broadcasters and read a lot of books written by Christians and all of that, you know and I know there is a language that is spoken in the church world. There's a religious language, and it's not just a language. There's even a tone. There's a demeanor that I'm going to say religious folks often have, and I don't mean this in a critical way, but there's just a nicety. There's just a protocol that you find sometime with public speakers. Some of these guys I know personally. I like them, but their whole demeanor and their words and their delivery, it's sweet. It drips with honey, and I like that. There's certainly nothing wrong with that, but the truth is I'm just not by temperament wired that way. My programs here, my podcasts are going to all be about love, about divine love. That'll be the underlying theme in all the podcasts. But, I'm a plain spoken kind of guy, so it's going to be plain talk. I'm not going to put my best foot forward for you. I'm just going to be myself. I'm just going to say what's in my mind. And the challenge with what I'm doing, namely speaking extemporaneously as I am right now, I don't have any notes in front of me. I didn't pre-plan this. And when you talk as much as a public speaker talks, the way I do, sometimes the things you say, you might have said differently if you had planned what you were going to say. But when you're talking extemporaneously, like I'm going to do in these podcasts, then it just comes out the way it comes out. And so you're going to get what's real. You're going to get my thoughts unfiltered. You're going to get plain talk, and you're going to get uncensored Steve McVey. So I hope that you can appreciate that. There are a lot of faults that I have, but I think that one thing I can commit to you about the podcasts that are to come is that I will be as transparent as I can possibly be. I'll be real. What you see is what you get. Folks that know me personally and know me well would be quick to tell you that I'm pretty much the same in public and private. Obviously, there's a such thing as discretion, so I don't mean I'm exactly the same with my most intimate friends that I would be publicly, but you get my point. There aren't two personalities, a public persona and a private persona. So it'll be, for that reason, plain talk. All right, now, let me give you a little bit of my background, especially if you're new to this podcast or new to me. Some of you, again, have been tracking with me for a lot of years, and I so value our relationship and the connection that we have had through these years. But I'm speaking now for those who might not be familiar with me or with anything I've written or with anything I've done. Little background. Let me start with today and say I'm not a religious person, but now let me go backward and give you some background. I grew up in a strong religious home. My parents were strong folks, Christian people. I went to church every time the doors were opened. And at the age of 19 years old, I believed and still would say that it was the right thing, that I was being pulled internally toward becoming a pastor of churches. And I did that. And I was a pastor for 21 years. Now, after leaving that pastoral role, I wrote a book called Grace Walk. And as that book gained traction and began to get some notoriety and began to be published in other languages, it opened opportunities for me to speak in a lot of different contexts all over the world. And I did that. And as I continued to grow in my own understanding of grace and of divine love, I found myself in a place where there was a widening gap between what I was believing now and what I had believed in years gone by. Now, that was disconcerting to me. It always is when you have a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts are troubling. And I want to challenge you to be open to have a paradigm shift in your own mind. You might need to swing to the left, or you might need to swing to the right. I don't know. Maybe you have no interest in, or little interest at least, in spiritual things. Certainly you might say, well, I'm not interested in Christianity. Well, I would say don't be gullible, but maybe you need to be willing to swing to the right. Or on the other end, maybe you're a fundamentalist. Maybe you're a church-going, Bible-carrying, praying every day, fundamentalist. And maybe you need to swing a little bit to the left and, relax a little bit. I'm just saying none of us have it all right, do we? None of us have it all right. So I think intellectual integrity necessitates that we be willing to change where we need to change. And so as you and I go forward in these podcasts, I just ask you to be willing to change. So back to my story. So as I moved forward in my own journey, I wrote that book called Grace Walk. And in that book, I wrote it 21 years ago now. So I would say some things differently that I wrote then, and I'd say some things the same. But bottom line is, when that book came out and began to gain traction, I began to see an opportunity to speak and teach and talk about the message that was real to me in other places. So I left the pastoral role. I haven't been a pastor of a church since 1994, and I continued to grow. I continued to evolve in my own thinking, and as I said, I saw a widening gap between where I was in my thinking and where I had been in previous years. And that was troubling because, again, as I started out saying before I got sidetracked here, paradigm shifts are troubling. Paradigm shifts require that we say, okay, all right, here's what I've always believed. But now that I'm considering this new viewpoint, I have to admit it's making sense. It makes sense. Now, the problem is that we often try to take new information that we have and assimilate it into the existing paradigm that we already have. And sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes new ideas fortify and undergird the ideas, the existing beliefs that you already have. But sometimes we encounter ideas that are so revolutionary, so transformational, that they cannot be assimilated into our existing paradigm. Instead, what we have to do is reject the old way of thinking. We have to say, I did believe this, but I've reconsidered it, and I don't believe that anymore. Now I believe this. That's what's happened in my own life. It's what's happened in my life. First of all, I'm going to talk about God, because that's the starting point. It's happened in my life in regard to my understanding of God and who He is. And so we have to be willing to say, I've been wrong. Here's what we tend to do. We all have this tendency. We tend to hear a new idea, and when we hear something new that's unfamiliar to us, our default setting is we begin to scan the hard drive of our brain. And we start looking at all the folders that we've built, that we've filed away in our brain, and we start looking for a place to file this new content, this new information. And if we can find a place to file it, we put it in there and we just assimilate it. But sometimes if we hear information that is absolutely new to us, and we cannot find an existing file in our brain in which to file it, then here's a sign of intellectual immaturity. What we tend to do is to say, nope, I reject that. I don't believe that. Never heard that before. That's not what I believe. And I don't think this is a matter necessarily of spiritual maturity or integrity. I think this is just old-fashioned intellectual maturity, because we all have to admit there's a lot we don't know, don't we? I mean, none of us think that we know everything, do we? And furthermore, do we think that what we believe now, everything we believe is exactly the way it really is? Do we think that we have single-handedly stumbled upon the mother lode of truth and we possess absolute clarity in the knowledge that is ours? Do we think we've got it all down pat and we're not wrong about anything? And so we need to be open. So back to my journey, I began to grow and I began to change my mind about some things. And to change my mind, I had to take that old paradigm, those old truths that I thought were true, that I'd held on to, those old ideas, and I had to put them aside and say, nope, don't believe that anymore. Again, I want to encourage you, don't think that you can automatically just take on new truth, or new, and no truth is new, but truth that's new to you. Don't think you can take that on and assimilate it into what you might believe right now. There has to be a humility if we're going to learn and grow. And part of that humility is we have to be willing to say, I was wrong about what I believed before. Jesus talked about that. He said, you can't put new wine in old wineskins, because if you do, the old wineskins will tear apart and they can't handle it. They can't contain the new. And so as you and I go forward, I'm going to be talking a lot about spiritual matters, and as a starting place, I'm going to talk about God. And I'm going to say some things about God that may be a contrarian position to what you have believed about God. I know I'm going to be saying some things about God that are very different from the things I grew up being taught. I'm going to say some things about God that are very different from what I taught others for a lot of years. And so to come with a contrarian truth that stands in stark contrast to the ideas that we already have, you can't just add it to it. You can't just add it to it. Now, if you're not one that grew up in church, you still have been influenced by the culture you live in to have a certain concept of spiritual things. And I want to encourage you, don't prejudge spirituality and don't prejudge God because of the bad rap that He has taken by zealots who have misrepresented Him. We're going to start, and I may not get to it today in this broadcast. It may be next time, but we're going to start with the very essence of God. We're going to start with the question: is there a God? Because that is a starting point. But I'll tell you, the reality is that a lot of folks who claim to represent God don't represent Him in an accurate way. All right, I'm going to give you this, and I won't have much time today. I want to say a little more about it, but I don't want to start a subject that I don't really have time to get into and unpack in this first program. So here's what I'm going to say. I don't believe in the same God I used to believe in. Let me throw this out there to you. Somebody asked me online on Facebook some time ago. They said, do you believe that Muslims worship the same God as Christians? Do you believe they worship the same God as Christians? And my answer was, I don't even think all Christians are worshiping the same God. Do you understand what I mean? We have a certain concept of God, and a Muslim will have one concept of God and who He is. And a Hindu will have another concept of God and who He is. And then I'll say on the broad scale, a Christian will have a concept of God and who He is. Christians believe in a triune God. Christians believe in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, a three-in-one God, three persons, one essence. But having said that, even among that school of faith, that family of faith called Christianity, there's a lot of difference between people about who God is. So does a Christian worship the same God as a Muslim? Well, yes and no. Yes, in that we're all reaching up to seek our Creator. There's only one Creator. So in the sense, we're all reaching out for the same God. But our perception, the answer is no, we're not worshiping the same God, in that the God of my paradigm may be different from the God of your paradigm. So in that sense, I don't think Christians and Muslims are understanding God in the same way. But now let me break it down further. As I said already, I don't even think among Christians we have the same concept of who God is. And so I'm going to say this. I'll give you this, and hopefully this will kind of be a tease make you want to listen to the next podcast as we get into that. I said, I don't worship the same God. I don't believe in the same God now that I did 25 years ago. Let me tell you, the God that I knew in my mind 25, 35 years ago is as different from the God that I understand today as the God of a Christian and a perspective may be different from the God of a Muslim perspective. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying? I'm saying that I'm atheistic when it comes to the God that I used to believe in. I don't believe in that God anymore. You say, well, what was that God like? Well, I'm not going to get into depth on it today, but I will say this. That God that I had conjured up in my own imagination through the help of external influence, that God is an angry God. That God, and I say God with a little g now, not a capital G, because He's a false God. That God is a judgmental, punitive, harsh God. That God is a God who excludes some people and includes other people. That God that I don't believe in anymore is a bookkeeper. He's a bookkeeper who's scrutinizing your every action, your every word, and even your every thought. And if any of that doesn't come up to par, you better get your act together, or one day you're going to pay for it. That God that I don't believe in anymore is a God who was so filled with rage against humanity and the sin of mankind that He sent His own Son down into this world, Jesus. And that God that I don't believe in anymore poured out absolute violent rage on Jesus because He just had to get it out of His system. And the way He got it out of His system was to pour it out on Jesus so He wouldn't have to pour it out on you. Now listen, if you're a good old-fashioned church-going Christian and that ruffles your feathers, all I can say is, I don't want you to be gullible, but are you open? Are you open to change? Keep listening. Hang with me in these podcasts. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but are you scared to be confronted with a different idea? Truth can withstand scrutiny. Now, if you're not a Christian and you're listening, you may be thinking, well, sheesh, that's not like the God I've heard church people talk about. No, it's not. No, it's not. You're right. That's not like the God you've heard most church people talk about. But that's the God I don't believe in anymore. A little g God, small g. A God who's angry, judgmental, punitive, into payback. Had to send Jesus down into this world so that he could vent his anger against him so he wouldn't have to vent his anger against us. I don't believe in that God anymore. I do not believe in that God. And that's what I'm going to talk about on this podcast each time. I'm going to talk about spiritual matters. We're going to talk about the God who is, not the little g God that we might have been told about, wrongly told about. So I hope you'll hang with me. If you will, we're just now rolling this thing out. So if you're on iTunes, give some thumbs up, give some props to the podcast on iTunes. And the reason for that is not because I need the props, not because I need the applause, but because your response to the podcast on iTunes will help. It'll cause them to promote the podcast more. So give it a thumbs up and give it a good rating so that you can help us get the word out there. All right, thanks for stopping by. Well, I'm going to keep this podcast down to about 15 to 25 minutes most of the time, and I'll connect with you next time. But thanks for coming by today. I hope you have a great day, and join me again next time for Plain Talk.
To hear and read more of Dr. Steve McVey's insights on living the life you were created to know, visit stevemcvey.com.